The human psyche is infinitely complex, which means new research comes out every day that helps illuminate why we are the way we are. And while some psychological studies provide us with fairly trivial psychological facts, for example, one University of Rochester study confirmed that, get ready for it, people are happier on the weekend. Others, however, are truly enlightening. Here are 15 psychological facts that will blow your mind. Number 1. What you see is not what your brain gets. Pause the video. Can you read this? What your eyes see is not what your brain ends up with. We think that we are walking around looking at the world around us with our eyes, and that our eyes are sending information to the brain, which processes it and gives us a realistic experience of what is out there. But the truth is that what our brain comes up with is not exactly what our eyes are actually seeing. Our brain is constantly interpreting everything it sees. Take for example the picture below. What do you see? Your first reaction is probably that you're looking at a triangle with a black border in the background and a white triangle upside down on top of it. Of course, that's not really what is there, is it? What's there are some partial lines and some partial circles. Your brain creates the shape of an upside down triangle out of blank space because that is what it is expecting to see. This particular illusion is called a kinesia triangle, named after an Italian psychologist who first came up with it in 1955. There are millions of sensory inputs coming into our brain every second, and our brain creates these shortcuts in order to quickly make sense out of the world around us. So it uses rules of thumb and extrapolates what it has experience with to make guesses about what it is seeing. Most of the time it works, but it is by no means immune to errors. The takeaway is that what we think people are going to see may not be what they do see. It might depend on their background, knowledge, familiarity with what they are looking at, and expectations. Conversely, we might be able to persuade people to see things in a certain way, depending on how they are presented. Here's another example from the So book. By using different colored backgrounds, we can draw attention and change the meaning of the sign. Do you think designers use these principles to draw attention on purpose? And if we can read so well with all these misspellings, are typos even a problem? Number 2. The brain looks for simple patterns. What do you see when you look at the X's below? Chances are you will say you see 4 sets of 2 X's each. You won't see them as 8 separate X's. You interpret the white space or lack of it as a pattern. Once again, recognizing patterns helps you make quick sense of all sensory input. Your eyes and your brain will want to create patterns even if there are no real patterns there. Research now points to the idea that we recognize certain basic shapes in what we are looking at, and we use these basic shapes called geons to recognize objects. Irving Biederman came up with the idea of geons in 1985. It's thought that there are 24 basic shapes that people recognize, and that these shapes are the building blocks of the objects we see and identify. Number 3. 9% of men and 5% of women are colorblind. The term color blindness is actually misleading. Most people who are colorblind are not blind to all colors, but really have a color deficiency that makes it hard for them to see differences between some colors. The most common is a difficulty distinguishing between reds, yellows, and greens. So what's the big deal, you might be saying? What colors you use in your photos, illustrations, maps, etc. can become problematic if you're trying to communicate information with colors. For example, the following image is commonly used to test for color blindness. On the right side, you can see what it looks like if you have red-green color blindness. If you're going to use color as a way to communicate, then you need to have a redundant coding scheme, for example color and line thickness, so that people who are colorblind will be able to decipher the coding without needing to see specific colors. Number 4. You imagine objects from above and tilt it, the canonical perspective. If you ask someone to draw a picture of a coffee cup, chances are they will draw something that looks like this. In fact, a researcher named Palmer went all around the world and asked people to draw a coffee cup, and the pictures above were what people drew. Notice the perspective of the cups. A few of them are straight on, but most are drawn from a perspective as if you were slightly above the cup looking down and offset a little to the right or left. This is called the canonical perspective. But no one he studied drew this. It seems to be a universal trait that we think about, remember, imagine, and recognize objects from this canonical perspective. Number 5. Dopamine makes you addicted to seeking information. Do you ever feel like you are addicted to email or Twitter or texting in general? Do you find it impossible to ignore your phone if you see that there are messages in your inbox? Have you ever gone to Google to look up some information and 30 minutes later you realize that you've been reading and linking and searching around for a long time and you are now searching for something totally different than before? You may have heard that dopamine controls the pleasure system of the brain, that dopamine makes you feel enjoyment, pleasure, and therefore motivates you to seek out certain behaviors such as food, sex, and drugs. The latest research, however, says otherwise. Instead of dopamine causing us to experience pleasure, dopamine causes seeking behavior. It causes us to want, desire, seek out, and search. It increases our general level of arousal and our goal-directed behavior. From an evolutionary standpoint, this is critical. The dopamine-seeking system keeps us motivated to move through our world, learn, and ultimately survive. Number 6. If you have a plan B, your plan A is less likely to work. Every now and then it hurts to be prepared. In a series of experiments from the University of Pennsylvania, researchers found that when volunteers thought about a backup plan before starting a task, they did worse than those who hadn't thought about a plan B. What's more, when they realized they had options, their motivation for succeeding the first time around dropped. The researchers stressed that thinking ahead is a good idea, but you might be more successful if you keep those plans vague. Number 7. When one rule seems too strict, you want to break more. Psychologists have studied a phenomenon called reactance. When people perceive certain freedoms being taken away, they not only break that rule, but they break even more than they otherwise would have in an effort to regain their freedom. This could be one of the best psychology facts to explain why a teenager who can't use his phone in class will chew gum while stealthily sending a text. Number 8. Fear can feel good if you're not really in danger. Not everyone loves scary movies, but for the people who do, there are a few theories as to why. The main one coming down to hormones. When you're watching a scary movie or walking through a haunted house, you get all the adrenaline, endorphins, and dopamine from a flight or fight response. But no matter how scared you feel, your brain recognizes that you're not really in danger, so you get the natural high without the risk. Number 9. The feeling of falling before sleeping. The sense of falling involved in a dream actually comes from the brain falling asleep too fast and assuming it is dying. The sensation is the brain giving itself an AED. Number 10. Food tastes better when someone else makes it. Ever wonder why that sandwich from the takeout place down the street tastes better than the ones you make at home, even if you use the same ingredients? One study published in the journal Science found that when you make yourself a meal, you're around it so long that it feels less exciting by the time you actually dig in, and that subsequently decreases your enjoyment. Number 11. You look for human faces, even in inanimated objects. We've all noticed cartoonish faces seemingly staring back at us from inanimated objects. That's called pareidolia, and scientists think it comes from the fact that recognizing faces is so important to social life that our brains would rather find one where there isn't one than miss a real-life face. Number 12. You can convince yourself a boring task was fun if you weren't rewarded. Here's another great example of cognitive dissonance. Volunteers in one Psychology of Learning and Motivation study did a boring task, then were paid either $1 or $20 to convince someone that it was actually pretty interesting. The ones who were paid $20 knew why they had lied. They got a decent reward and still thought it was boring. But the ones who had only gotten a buck actually convinced themselves it was really fun, because their brains didn't have a good reason to think they had been lying. Number 13. Your brain doesn't think long-term deadlines are so important. Pretty much everyone has procrastinated at one time or another, even though we know logically that it would make more sense to get a jump on our taxes than to turn on Netflix. We prefer urgent, unimportant tasks because we know we'll be able to complete them. There's also evidence that when we see the deadline looming in terms of days, rather than months or years, because we feel more connected to a day-by-day passing of time. Number 14. The brain itself can't feel pain. Ever wonder how brain surgeons are able to perform surgeries on patients while they're awake? Even though the brain has layers of coverings and blood vessels that contain pain receptors, the brain itself has zero. When a person has a headache, for example, it's often thought of as pain stemming from the brain, but this is actually not the case. The muscles and skin surrounding the brain, however, can feel pain. Number 15. Your brain can rewire itself. Neuroplasticity, or the brain's ability to reorganize and change itself throughout a person's lifetime, is a truly remarkable thing. In one 2011 study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science, University of Montreal, researchers compared the brain activity of individuals who were born blind and those who had normal vision. They found that the part of the brain that's normally wired to work with our eyes can instead rewire itself to process sound information instead of visual perception. Made up of gray fats and proteins, the human brain doesn't look like much. Nevertheless, it is one of the most complex and mysterious organs known, giving life to art, sport, personality, and morals. With over 68 billion neurons, 2.5 million gigabytes of storage, and over 50,000 thoughts per day, the human brain is truly astonishing. If you found value and enjoyed watching, give this video a thumbs up and subscribe for more videos.